This video is brought to you by Squarespace, your all-in-one solution to create beautiful websites from scratch. In Albert Einstein's study in Berlin, 3 portraits hung on the wall. The first of Michael Faraday, the second of James Clerk Maxwell, 2 giants in the field of physics. But the third portrait was not of a physicist. On Einstein's wall hung a picture of Arthur Schopenhauer. In the study of another physicist, Erwin Schrödinger, of Schrödinger's cat fame, lay a folder of papers marked with the conspicuous title Collection of Thoughts on the Physical Principium Individuationis. Yet again, this is an unmistakable reference to Arthur Schopenhauer, whose idea of the Principium Individuationis takes center stage in his metaphysical theory of existence. In fact, Schrödinger was influenced by Schopenhauer from youth, and he continued to be fascinated by the philosopher until late in life. He called him the greatest savant of the West, and even considered switching his study from physics to philosophy. He once opened a lecture with the following words: "The world extended in space and time is but our representation." Wolfgang Pauli, another theoretical physicist who pioneered quantum physics, had a lifelong interest in philosophy and psychology, and even had a letter exchange with Carl Jung. In those letters, he often referenced Schopenhauer. For example, when discussing a Schopenhauer essay on coincidence and fate, which he linked with Jung's conception of synchronicity. Pauli had the following to say about Schopenhauer's essay: "This essay of Schopenhauer's had a lasting and fascinating effect on me, and seemed to be pointing the way to a new trend in natural sciences." It's very clear that he thought that Schopenhauer would be, or at least deserved to be, an extremely influential figure, not just in philosophy, but in science as well. In the domain of religion too, Pauli had a penchant for Schopenhauer. As you well know, when it comes to religion and philosophy, my background is Lao Tse and Schopenhauer. The mention of Lao Tse, and therefore Eastern philosophy in general, is worth talking about a little bit. It is largely the accomplishment of Schopenhauer that Eastern philosophy exerted an influence on Western thought. During Schopenhauer's lifetime, many Eastern texts were getting their first Latin translations from the Sanskrit, making them available to an educated Western audience. It was Schopenhauer, however, who fully embraced them and found them worthy of discussion. Not in the least because many branches of Eastern philosophy came to the same conclusions as his own Western philosophy, of course. Near the end of his life, Schopenhauer had a bronze statue of the Buddha in his home, named his pet poodle Atman, and believed that the Western discovery of Eastern texts would lead to a renaissance in Europe, similar to how the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts had caused a flourishing of Europe centuries prior. As it turns out, such a renaissance never came to be. But through Schopenhauer, many intellectuals found their way towards Eastern philosophy and religion. His famous shining endorsement of the Upanishads as the production of the highest human wisdom, coupled with his rising popularity, especially after his death, led many to read the Upanishads for themselves. And with them, of course, the Bhagavad Gita. You can guess where this is going.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Oppenheimer never explicitly mentioned Schopenhauer's influence, but considering his wide intellectual curiosity and the fact that many notable physicists around him, Schrödinger in particular, were intimately familiar with Schopenhauer, it's hard to make the case that he was not at least a little bit aware of Schopenhauer's ideas. And even so, although this is of course speculative, we might reasonably assume that without Schopenhauer's embrace and popularization of Eastern philosophy, Oppenheimer wouldn't have become interested in Eastern texts in the first place. So, I hope that the case is sufficiently made that Schopenhauer exerted some influence on the development of quantum physics. Let's take a deeper dive into Schopenhauer's philosophy and see why that is. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Squarespace is an all-in-one website building platform. Whether you're creating a personal portfolio or managing a brand, Squarespace has you covered. If you're into literature and philosophy, a great way to integrate what you learn is to write about it. Within 2 minutes of setting up a Squarespace website, you can find the perfect blog template to do so. You don't need any coding knowledge, and it's easy and intuitive to get started using their fluid engine. Just drag and drop. There's also a huge library of extensions to extend the functionality of your website. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Welgeist to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Now, back to Schopenhauer and the Principium Individuationis. There is this idea that recurs throughout Schopenhauer's writings, that pops up again and again in the most unexpected of places, a concept that runs through his entire philosophy like a recurring motif in music. And this is Schopenhauer's concept of the Principium Individuationis. The importance of this concept for Schopenhauer's philosophy cannot be overstated. Yet, something curious happens when we take a moment to reflect on its prominent place in his work. To us readers in the 21st century, it seems like Schopenhauer is endlessly and tirelessly pointing out the extremely obvious. What is the Principium Individuationis? Broadly speaking, Schopenhauer is talking about the Latin term used by the scholastics for, you can guess, the principle of individuation. The question is, how can we differentiate between one object and the next? What is it that separates one thing from another? In other words, how can we conceptualize multiplicity in the world? Keep the word multiplicity in mind because it's important. It's simply the state of there being multiple things in the world. Now, specifically, what does Schopenhauer say about this principle? What is it that makes it so I can conceptualize two different apples lying next to each other on the table, for example? Schopenhauer says it's simply time and space. Time and space are the things that separate objects in the world. In other words, the fact that you can look at one tree standing next to another tree is by virtue of the Principium Individuationis, which is simply another way of saying because there is such a thing as space and time, you can differentiate between two trees in a field. The difference between two trees is a matter of space. The difference between an acorn and an oak tree is a matter of time. That sounds so astoundingly obvious today that it's almost unbelievable that Schopenhauer would spend so much time on it. But it's precisely this continuous laboring of the point that should give us pause. Why insist on this so relentlessly? The answer is because in the historical context in which Schopenhauer wrote, things weren't quite so obvious. Because this question of the Principium Individuationis opens up a can of worms that takes us through 2000 years of philosophy, not only dealing with the nature of individuation, but also with the nature of space, time, human cognition, sense perception, and even how language relates to all of this. Things are rarely as simple as they seem at first glance. The influential view of Aristotle, for example, makes no mention of time or space at all. For Aristotle, the key difference between two individuals is their difference in number as expressed through matter. So we can imagine two identical twins who look exactly alike, indistinguishable from each other. Yet we know that they are two different individuals by virtue of them both having a different matter. Their form, the species to which they belong, is exactly the same, but the difference is expressed in matter, and therefore matter must be the Principium Individuationis. This view held sway over Western philosophy for millennia, as medieval philosophers such as Averroes and Thomas Aquinas further fleshed it out, and, writing in Latin, finally coined the term Principium Individuationis. But what interests us most of all is what modern philosophy, starting roughly with Descartes, did with this principle. Because it's in this time period that we do away with Aristotelian metaphysics, which focused on form and matter as the essence of things, his so-called helomorphism. It seems like an entirely new world opened up with Descartes, where we no longer think in terms of the four causes, substance and accident, form and matter. We become instead concerned with time, space, and atoms. For Aristotle, matter was something fundamental. It cannot be further deconstructed into different parts. Matter is the end of the road. It exists as a principle together with and dependent on form to create substances or things. But in the modern era, it seemed like matter was not so fundamental after all. Matter exists of something. Something that some pre-Socratic Greeks had speculated upon but could never scientifically prove. But in the modern era, the realization came that matter is composed of atoms. However, the atom posed new problems. There were disagreements on the divisibility of the atom and on the nature of space. Descartes posited a radical dualism in which the world has two mutually exclusive aspects, res cogitans and res extensa. This is so-called mind-body dualism. The mind, the soul, anything that has no physical property, yet still exists, is part of the res cogitans, which is simply Latin for thinking thing. Matter, on the other hand, is now defined exclusively as res extensa, which is Latin for thing that is extended. In other words, something that takes up space. Note how this was absent in the Aristotelian view. For Aristotle, matter was a principle of content, for example, marble, while form was the principle of form. For example, a statue of David. Descartes changed this view of matter by explicitly and irrevocably linking it with a conception of space. The mere fact that matter occupies space is for Descartes enough. But Isaac Newton took the definition of Descartes and added a few other properties inherent to matter, such as hardness, impenetrability, mobility, and inertia. But more importantly, Newton conceived of space as absolute, holding the view that space is essentially a big void in which objects exist. It has an existence independent of those objects, meaning that if no objects existed at all, there would still be empty space. But this view was far from accepted at the time. His contemporary Leibniz argued that space presupposes matter instead of the other way around. Thus, all space depends on the matter that exists in it. In a famous quote, you can argue that Leibniz anticipated Einstein's theory of relativity. As for my own opinion, I have said more than once that I hold space to be something merely relative, as time is, that I hold it to be an order of coexistences, as time is an order of successions. And it's in this tension between Leibniz and Newton, Descartes and Aristotle, that Schopenhauer takes a firm stand about his conception of space. What seems obvious to us in hindsight only appears so because centuries of time and millions of words and billions of thoughts have come before us, and gradually, slowly, some ideas stand the test of time and others perish. And we live in the present time, at the very tail end of this long movement, when all is said and done, and when we can assess the damage, like a general counting the dead and wounded after a battle. But while the struggle is still raging on, in the heat of battle, in the fog of war, things are never as clear as they are in hindsight. And the story becomes more complicated still, as up till now we have only discussed space as if it's something that exists in the world, objectively and actually, when, in fact, that's the very thing that Schopenhauer rejects, because one other figure has remained unmentioned so far, and that is, of course, Immanuel Kant. Kant was an earthquake in philosophy. Not since Plato, it can be argued, has one man influenced so much of subsequent philosophy. We need to talk about transcendental idealism. Kant's great contribution to philosophy was the idea that space and time are forms of human intuition and that they do not have an existence independent of our cognition. In other words, time and space, among other such forms, are not features of the world as such, or, in Kant's terms, of the world in itself. They are rather simply components of how our mind operates and interprets reality. This idea radically changed how philosophy dealt with the concept of space. In the Newtonian view, influenced by Descartes, space is an absolute void. If there were no humans, no cognition to make sense of the world, space would still exist. Space, in the Newtonian framework, is not dependent upon human cognition to exist. But Kant says that space is precisely the way in which the mind orders and arranges reality. Therefore, without human cognition, space does not exist. This spacelessness of the world in itself, the world without a human cognition, is impossible for us to conceptualize. Just try it. Imagine empty space. If you imagine an empty room or a dark void, a black screen, you've already failed. You are stuck in your body and mind. You're a human having thoughts. You cannot step outside of your mind, so to speak, and look at the world in a truly objective sense. That is to say, without interference of your own psychology and your own subjectivity. For this reason, Kant has been called the all-destroyer by his contemporaries. By showing that the real world, beyond the world of appearance as ordered in time and space by our cognition, is fundamentally inaccessible to us, Kant destroyed the possibility of metaphysics, because metaphysics is exactly the study of the world beyond mere appearance, an investigation into the true nature of the world. But Kant has shown that this is inaccessible to us. Suddenly, space was not just an object in the world or a container for objects, something we could study from a distance. No. Now, space was a part of who we are, of how we view the world. And what's worse, we cannot step outside of our own viewpoint and take an objective look at this thing that we call space, just like a fish cannot step away from the ocean and ponder the water. In a nutshell, what is Kant's most important contribution? The idea that time and space have their ultimate reality in the mind, not in the world in itself. What does that mean? Now the world is split into two. There is the real world, forever hidden from us. And there is the world as we experience it. Now, what can we say about this real world? Kant says nothing. Schopenhauer says something. We finally come back to the Principium Individuationis. Recall that the Principium Individuationis is the principle by which things occupy a different time and a different space. In other words, it is the principle by which multiplicity occurs in the world, the state of there being multiple, separate things. But here comes the kicker. The Principium Individuationis is a defining feature of the world as appearance, or as Schopenhauer calls it, the world as representation. In other words, and simplifying a fair bit here, we can say that time and space, as we ordinarily understand it, only exist in the world as representation, in the world of the senses. The other world, the real world as Kant would have it, is simply not the type of thing that has space or has time. In modern terms, we might say that this world beyond appearance simply has no spatio-temporal dimension. For Kant, this means that this world is forever closed off from our cognition. Apart from the purely a priori reasoning that it must exist logically, we cannot say anything definitive about the character of this world. But for Schopenhauer, Kant overlooked something fundamental. What is the opposite of multiplicity? It's unity. Schopenhauer argued that it is indeed possible to say something definite about this beyond world, namely, because of its spacelessness and timelessness, it is characterized by some kind of fundamental unity or oneness. Of course, strictly speaking, we are dealing with a metaphor here, because unity, in order for us to understand it, still requires a conception of space. But this is the point at which language becomes insufficient to describe thought, as our language itself is steeped in our cognition, which itself counts on time and space for its forms. To even utter a sentence or think a thought, we require time. So, in a way, Kant was right in that we are fundamentally closed off from this other real world, in that we have no way of functionally talking or thinking about it. But Schopenhauer employs the metaphor of oneness to denote the characteristic of spacelessness and timelessness, which are impossible for us to imagine except through metaphor. We cannot imagine something that is spaceless and timeless except as a vague abstraction, a logical exercise. So the metaphor of oneness helps us to conceptualize the strange alien world and make something useful out of it that we can build upon. Keep in mind that our knowledge must necessarily fall short. We cannot truly know this world beyond, which Kant called the noumenal world and which Schopenhauer called the world as will. But Kant maintained we couldn't have any knowledge, whereas Schopenhauer says we can have some knowledge. We have explored how exactly Schopenhauer came to these conclusions in a 40-minute video going through his main work, so check that one out if you're interested. For the purposes of this video, suffice to say the following. For Schopenhauer, the real world that exists beyond mere appearance is a fundamental unity of being where everything happens at the same time and in the same place. And the world as we experience it is simply a reflection of this unity as it passes through our cognition. By virtue of our being thinking subjects, we view the fundamental unity at the heart of things through different successions in time and different locations in space. For Schopenhauer, these two worlds are one and the same, two sides of the same coin. We can employ the metaphor of light here, where light going through a prism is shown to actually consist of different spectral components or colors. The unfiltered light is the world as will, The prism is our cognition, and the rainbow colors are the world as representation. But all of this has led us quite far astray from quantum physics. Although it's not hard to see how this train of thought served as an inspiration to quantum physicists. Most of them, to be sure, are not idealists in the philosophical sense of the word. They don't believe in the Kantian framework that Schopenhauer integrated into his own philosophy. But on a higher level, more generally speaking, we can see some similarities between the quantum world and the Schopenhauer world. Most fundamentally, there is the discovery in quantum physics that our perception of reality seems to influence how that reality appears to us. That is to say, that there is no strict pre-existing world, but that the world as we perceive it only takes shape because of our perceiving of it. This idea is extremely analogous to Schopenhauer's idealism, and he himself worded it best. It then becomes clear and certain to him that what he knows is not a sun and an earth, but only an eye that sees a sun, a hand that feels an earth, that the earth which surrounds him is there only as idea, i.e. only in relation to something else, the consciousness, which is himself. Schopenhauer was not aware of quantum physics, of course, let alone on the workings of the double-slit experiment or other such discoveries. But we can say through his influence, he laid the groundwork for the possibility of these discoveries. And I assume he would be very pleased with that, as Schopenhauer considered science as an extension of philosophy, and he held that a good philosophical theory should explain scientific phenomena as well. If philosophy is opposed to science, then chances are that philosophy is not very good. By the way, in the same way, we can say that he paved the way for Darwin and the theory of evolution by preparing the minds of readers to accept that the drive for procreation is the fundamental desire of everything that lives. The idea that our perception of reality can influence reality was an idea that was necessary for physicists 100 years later to interpret the findings of, for example, the double-slit experiment. And Erwin Schrödinger, in 1958, published his lecture series called Mind and Matter, in which he expounds a Schopenhauer-inspired view of consciousness and how it relates to physical reality. The book is extremely interesting on its own, and if there is enough interest, we can do a full deep dive video on it. Definitely leave a comment if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. Anyway, many of these first-generation quantum physicists were strongly influenced by the German philosophical landscape, which was created in large part in Schopenhauer's shadow, and many of their personal, philosophical or religious beliefs were influenced by these philosophies. It's not, of course, that Schopenhauer predicted or anticipated quantum physics. That would be stretching the truth quite a bit. But we can reasonably say that the underlying worldview expounded by Schopenhauer, the idea that our world is but a representation of something fundamentally alien and ungraspable, something that forever lies beyond what we can reasonably assert about reality, but yet that we feel is out there somewhere, teasing us with possibility. This idea spoke to these men as they were doing science away from the absolutism of Newton into new and relative territory. Without this long line of ideas, from Aristotle's view on matter and form, to Descartes and the introduction of the concept of space, to Newton and Leibniz arguing about the nature of space and whether it's absolute or relative, all the way to Kant and his transcendental idealism that asked new questions about how our consciousness relates to reality, and ultimately arriving at Schopenhauer, who went a step further than Kant and posited a world of will, where everything happens everywhere all at once, and how our experience in the world is simply a kaleidoscopic snapshot of this fundamental unity at the heart of reality. This long line of ideas paved the way for science to follow in its footsteps. The luminaries of the quantum age took grateful inspiration from Schopenhauer and his almost mystical ideas about fundamental reality, and it prepared their minds to accept the paradoxical and strange outcomes of the quantum world. When Erwin Schrödinger called Schopenhauer the greatest savant of the West, this is what he meant, because he recognized that Schopenhauer intuited fundamental truths about the universe and our place in it way before science was ready by experiment to confirm them. From the idea that perception shapes reality all the way to evolution by natural selection. And that, in short, is why quantum physicists love Schopenhauer. Thank you for watching. This big video wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of our Patreons. join their ranks and get access to a dozen exclusive videos by clicking the link in the description. If you want more of this content, simply liking the video and leaving a comment also helps out a big deal. With that said, again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.